One of the things that's true about language, and especially about speech, is that it's sequential. We can't say 6 words at the same time. Just can't do it.
I'm
Can't
pretty sure
happen.
my son could when he was really young, but in any case, it's
Yeah.
usually true.
Yeah, usually true. But if you have pictures of those 6 words, let's say there's 6
Yeah.
animals, and you present a picture, you can see all 6 at the same time.
Hmm.
So that difference we call sequential versus parallel processing. And there are certain kinds of visual spatial skills that can be done more in parallel, and other kinds of skills and tasks which require more sequential activity. And of course, real human creativity, I think, requires both. And this is why we have this massive fiber bundle that connects the two hemispheres together so that they can work in an integrated way. And so I think it's really an oversimplification to think that the right hemisphere is creative and the left is not. I think, every human being has the potential to be creative. And I think that when humans are the most creative, we're harnessing the full capabilities of our brain. It's not just the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere, it's both.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Dharma Lab. I'm Cortland Dahl. I'm here with Dr. Richard Davidson, who we all affectionately call Richie, one of the great living neuroscientists on the planet. And we're today going to continue a discussion that we've had previously about some of Richie's most important early work. So, Richie, I'm super excited to ask you about this, in part because I myself have always wanted to just geek out and hear a lot about these things. And we have always a million things to talk about, but I never can talk to you about this. So, in a previous episode, we talked about your very early research when you were just at Harvard coming out of grad school and your early work that showed differences between the different hemispheres of the brain and what's uh, most simply referred to as the asymmetry between these different hemispheres. And we talked a lot about that. We can put a link to that previous discussion. This is back in the late 70s and into the 80s. Something very interesting happened in the 90s. And I remember I was just, I graduated from high school in 1992 and was just starting college. And there was a book at that time, and there was all sorts of stuff in the popular media about asymmetry, although that word was probably not used. But I remember a lot of things about the left side and right side of the brain. And there was a book that I think was something like drawing from the right side of the brain or something along those lines. But it was pointing actually in many ways to your work, which, you were very much at the forefront of and had been for many years at that point. But I imagine, like many things, there was probably a lot of oversimplification and basically perhaps even misunderstandings about what the science really says and what's really going on in the brain. So maybe we could just start there, going back to this discussion about asymmetry and what your research and other researchers were really finding about these different hemispheres of the brain and how it relates to things like creativity and being more logical and all the kind of stuff that was at work in our popular conversations about the brain at that time.
Yeah, thank you for that great introduction. And there's so much to say. And, just being primed with that brings back such intense memories from that period. And I was very much living this. And uh, I published, I don't know how many papers, but I'm sure more than 100 papers on brain asymmetry in one way or another, and edited a book, actually edited 2 books on brain asymmetry that were published by MIT Press, that were major compendiums at the time, with a neuroscientist in Norway by the name of Kenneth Hugdahl, one of my early collaborators. So, yeah, there's so much to say. So let's begin by asking where these ideas may have come from. In the previous episode of Dharma Lab, where we began to introduce this topic, one of the things we talked about is that the left hemisphere can speak and has language much more so than the right hemisphere, at least in most people. And I should say that these broad generalizations about the left and the right hemisphere are roughly true for right-handed people only. They're not true necessarily for people who write with their left hand. That itself is a whole topic of really interesting conversation, and we'll bracket it. We can come back to it today briefly. But for now, and I apologize to all you lefties out there, but since the majority of people are right-handed, roughly 85%. We'll just stick with that for now. One of the questions that scientists pose is if the left hemisphere can speak and really is the primary province of language, what is the right hemisphere there doing? It's not just, presumably not just an appendage and not just there to structurally sort of latch on to the left hemisphere to hold it in place. It's got to be doing something. And does it have some specialized role? If the left hemisphere is specialized more for language, is there some set of functions for which the right hemisphere may be better than the left hemisphere? So what scientists discovered is that there are certain kinds of visual and spatial kinds of tasks that the right hemisphere seems to be better at. Now, when we say better, what we mean is typically a little bit better. It's not like they're absolute differences. It's not like the right hemisphere can do this and the left hemisphere can't do this. And similarly for language, although for language, the lateralization seems to be more definitive, and particularly for speaking. So for right-handed people, it's pretty much the case that the left hemisphere can speak and the right hemisphere cannot speak. And that's pretty clear. And there are various ways in which that's been demonstrated, which I'll leave to the side for now. But let me get back to this, the title of this popular book, that Drawing from the Right Side of Your Brain. There was a lot of hype that the right hemisphere is the creative hemisphere and the left hemisphere is the analytic hemisphere, and it got overgeneralized, like the right hemisphere, is more interesting and the left hemisphere is boring. Those kind of generalizations really, in my view, were taken way too far. And the other really important thing to keep in mind is that within a hemisphere, there's a lot of specialization as well. And so the anterior portions of the cerebral cortex, the prefrontal region, are doing something quite different than the back of the brain. The visual areas or the parietal area, is an area where visual information, auditory information, and kinesthetic information are all integrated. It's kind of a multi-sensory melting pot. So these characterizations may apply to certain specific regions within a hemisphere and not necessarily to the whole hemisphere. But the other thing that's so important to keep in mind is that in most of us that are neurologically, quote, normal, that we have basically intact brains, there are roughly 200 million neurons that are connecting one side of the brain to the other. It's a huge number. It's the largest white matter fiber bundle in the brain. White matter are the axons that connect neurons together. And there are 200 million neurons that are connecting many different parts, virtually the entire, from the front to the back of the brain, the two hemispheres together. So that if I were to present information to one hemisphere, and you can do this, presented initially to one hemisphere, by doing certain tricks. And so it turns out that if you're focusing straight ahead and you present information on the left side of that fixation point, that information will be projected initially to the right side of the brain. So the pathways are crossed. And similarly, if you're focusing straight ahead and you present information to the right of that fixation point, it goes to the left hemisphere of the brain. But the moment it gets to one hemisphere, it's automatically transferred to the other hemisphere, so that both hemispheres are going to be recipients unless you, for whatever reason, have damage to the fiber bundle that's connecting the two hemispheres. And in the previous episode of Dharma Lab Court, you brought up the case of split brain patients whose corpus callosum, which is the fiber bundle, the main fiber bundle that connects the two hemispheres of the brain together, that's been surgically severed. And it's not done very much anymore, but in patients who have very severe epilepsy that originates in one hemisphere and spreads to the other hemisphere to produce this huge grand mal seizure, it's been found that if you surgically separate the hemispheres, you can actually very dramatically reduce the severity of the epilepsy. So that has been done. It's not done very much anymore, but there was a time when that kind of neurosurgery was done. And so there are patients walking around with two hemispheres that were relatively independent, where the fiber bundle was severed. But in most of us, that's not true, and our two hemispheres are talking together all the time. And so whatever specialization might exist, which it does exist to some extent, the two hemispheres are typically cooperating and are sending information rapidly back and forth.
And so I'm curious, so when you maybe there's two big questions I want to ask. And one goes back to the book and the stuff in the popular culture, but maybe let's set that aside for just a moment. You had been researching this stuff for a long time. I mean, you started back in the 70s, and this was a huge focus of yours, clearly in the 80s. What were the things amidst these hundreds of papers that you studied, plus hundreds of more in the broader field with other colleagues and researchers? What were the things that were surprising? Like, when was your mind kind of blown, or when were you surprised, or what were the big breakthroughs that you were like, whoa, I didn't see that coming, or that really
I
shifted the
would say the
understanding in some
biggest
way?
breakthrough was these were days before MRI was available, before functional MRI was available. And
So
so
most of this was
to
like
make
EEG, like looking at electrical patterns in the brain.
exactly, so we were looking at EEG, electrical patterns from scalp electrodes that were non-invasive. You've had that done to yourself. And we can make some inferences about how activation patterns are shifting and occurring using that method. The thing that was the most mind-blowing to us, I think, from all this work is that when you put these electrodes on people and you just ask them, we always, before we gave them tasks, we always told them to please just sit and rest. And we do 8 minutes where they'd alternate between 1 minute of eyes open and 1 minute of eyes closed. And we collect 8 minutes of quote resting data.
So you were doing, I mean,
Um,
we do this in, of course, brain imaging all the time as well, but like this sort of like early resting state, analysis essentially.
Exactly.
That's
So,
cool.
we typically did very little with that in the early days. Actually, in the very early days, the honest truth is we did nothing with that. It was just a time to make sure our recordings were accurate. If there was any tweaks in calibration, if an electrode was not placed, was not making contact, we'd fix it at that time. But we throw out the data because we're interested in what happens when we give them tasks and looking at changes in the brain. Turns out that we were throwing out the most interesting data initially, which was what people were showing when they were just sitting and resting and not doing anything. And it turned out that the activation pattern, some people had greater activation on the left side of their brain when they were sitting and resting, or other people had greater activation on the right side.
Yeah.
And that differed depending on whether the electrodes were in the back of the head or the front of the head. So it wasn't the same across the hemispheres. And when we first started seeing this stuff and paying attention to it, we thought, oh, it can't be it can't really be stable. It's not like it can't be a characteristic of people. So we brought people back a week later, a month later,
So
and we
you thought it was
tested
just
them.
sort of like random kind
Yeah,
of
just,
shifting. And if you look long
yeah,
enough, you would just see that everybody was all over the place and you just got a
exactly.
snapshot, but you didn't want to draw
It,
any conclusions.
exactly. So then we brought people back, several weeks later, several months later, and unbelievable that it was super stable.
Hmm.
So if a person was showing us left-sided activation today, if we tested them 3 months from now, we'd almost certainly see a very similar pattern 3 months later.
So this is like a neural
And it
disposition, basically.
a neural disposition. Didn't matter who the people were that were putting on the electrodes, who was testing them, what day of the week it was. Um, they were showing a very stable pattern and remarkably stable.
Hmm.
Um, and that really blew our minds. We were not expecting that at all. Um, and then once we started discovering that, we then thought, well, if this is really a stable characteristic, then it must be associated with some behavioral differences, experiential differences. And that's when we started our whole journey into this domain of affective style or emotional style, which refers to enduring ways in which people respond differently to emotional challenges. And, we discovered a whole bunch of interesting things with that. But this is like a really great case of, sometimes what we first think of as noise turns out to be the most interesting part of our experiment. And fortunately, we were we were paying enough attention that it enabled us to really discover something novel.
And it's so funny that there's such a parallel with how the default mode network was discovered later with the, imaging research, which almost the exact same thing. It's just sort of like accidentally in these resting state periods. But in any case, so that seems like a natural segue into what eventually became, this popular meme around the brain and this, the left side and right side. And it's kind of funny how I feel like it becomes almost like a caricature of the brain. We've talked elsewhere about dopamine or the amygdala, and there's like some finding, which is maybe like a legitimate, genuine scientific insight, but then we draw all sorts of conclusions and, it becomes good and bad and just overly simplistic and we lose the nuance. So if we translate that into what you actually learned, in this case, it sounds like a lot about emotion. So we're at some point going to talk about the whole field of affective neuroscience, because I'm imagining in those early days, you weren't necessarily even thinking necessarily about emotion as a guiding kind of principle, but it sounds like it sort of
Well, we
naturally
we
led you into that realm,
Well,
or
we
was
were
that?
thinking about emotion early on. That was part of what we were trying to do, and we were thinking about it particularly with regard to what role the prefrontal cortex was playing in
Hmm.
emotion. And in the last episode of Dharma Lab, I mentioned this obscure paper that was written by a very famous neuroanatomist at
This was the
MIT.
cult classic of scientific research, I
Right.
remember.
Yeah, and this was a guy that I studied neuroanatomy with, by the name of Wally Nauta, Nauta, and he wrote this paper that was published in a journal called the Journal of Psychiatric Research, where he speculated for the first time, really by a mainstream scientist, about the role of the prefrontal cortex in emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really what got me started on this path to look at the prefrontal cortex and emotion. But the hype about brain asymmetry really was focused on the specializations in the back of the brain, not the front of the brain. We were really the first to introduce the notion of asymmetries in the front of the brain that may be related to emotion. But there was earlier work on asymmetries that had to do with language and visual spatial processes that were more focused on what's going on in the back of the brain. And the right brain coloring book is really alluding to work that's focused on specialization of the two hemispheres in the back, not in the front.
And what a lot of the stuff in the popular culture gave the impression of is that you could kind of choose, like even the title of that book. Like I could say, oh, I want to write and draw, probably not write. I want to draw from the right side of my brain, and somehow I'm gonna, I don't know, shut off the left side. I mean, I'm not even. To what degree is this under volitional control? I'm kind of guessing it's not, that just some function, some activity, but maybe not. To what degree is it? Is there any
Well,
volitional aspect to it?
one of the very early papers that I published, which, I haven't thought about this in literally decades, but we did a very early biofeedback study where we gave people feedback not based on the activation in one hemisphere or the other, but based on the difference in activation. And so we were giving them feedback to change their asymmetry. And we, in fact, found that people were able to do that to some extent with very little training, just using this kind of neurofeedback.
And could you, I'm just curious, like on the one hand, that sort of makes sense to me that you could, because you could learn quite quickly what you're doing that makes something go up or down. But it's kind of a different thing to say a given function like drawing and then make that like just that specific activity, because it sounds like there's certain, I mean, like language, for example, there's probably nothing you're going to do that's going to shift that to the right side of the brain. Like language, like just by definition, certain functions, certain processes, certain activities are going to be more, are going to, fall to one side or the other. But when it came to all the stuff in the popular culture, did that make sense to you? I mean, did it feel like it was drawing on something that was legitimate, or did it feel like, okay, we're now just in some hand wavy territory?
There was a grain of truth, but it was way overgeneralized. But, and it, again, it's referring to the extent that it is at all grounded, it's referring to what may be going on in posterior parts of the cortex, mostly the parietal and temporal regions of the brain. But it's interesting to ask what may be a fundamental dimension that is actually the basis of this lateralization. And that was a question that was asked early on. So you can ask the question, why is it that language is more specialized to the left hemisphere? Is there something about the left hemisphere in those regions that is more conducive or preferential for language? And what's going on in the right hemisphere that may be more conducive to certain kinds of visual and spatial functions? And one of the core dimensions that's been studied, it's not to say that this is definitive at all, but one of the things that's true about language, and especially about speech, is that it's sequential. We can't say 6 words at the same time. Just can't do it.
I'm
Can't
pretty sure
happen.
my son could when he was really young, but in any case, it's
Yeah.
usually true.
Yeah, usually true. But if you have pictures of those 6 words, let's say there's 6
Yeah.
animals, and you present a picture, you can see all 6 at the same time. So that difference we call sequential versus parallel processing. And there are certain kinds of visual spatial skills that can be done more in parallel, and other kinds of skills and tasks which require more sequential activity. And of course, real human creativity, I think, requires both. And this is why we have this massive fiber bundle that connects the two hemispheres together so that they can work in an integrated way, and utilize whatever the specialization might be in each hemisphere together in a synergistic way to accomplish something that may be greater than either hemisphere alone can accomplish. And so I think it's really an oversimplification to think that the right hemisphere is creative and the left is not. I think, every human being has the potential to be creative. And I think that when humans are the most creative, we're harnessing the full capabilities of our brain. It's not just the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere, it's both. And so, I think that's one of the really important take home messages. And one of the speculations that is super interesting, although there's really not been very much science around this, is that what may really stimulate creativity is tasks that require a lot of interhemispheric coordination.
Hmm.
One class of tasks that require a lot of interhemispheric coordination are certain kinds of motor tasks. So, for example, jugglers who are juggling, that requires a lot of interhemispheric coordination. It's not just hand eye coordination, but it's coordinating what's happening between the two hands. And one of the things we know is that pretty much the control of the right hand is in the left motor region of the brain, and the left hand is pretty much controlled by the right side of the brain. And if the hands are working together, it requires interaction between them. And so, one of the really interesting untested hypotheses is whether exercises that facilitate this kind of interhemispheric coordination may be beneficial for certain kinds of other creative activities that may have nothing to do with these motor tasks.
Hmm. So just doing something, I mean, we talked about this Tibetan practice of mudras where you're doing things like with your hands, but what's going on with one hand is totally different than what's going on with the other hand. It's like the whole thing where you pat your head and then you're circling, but it's like that on steroids. Like it's like it's almost like they have to operate completely independently, but it goes against some biological wiring. You have to like retrain something deep to do that. But that would be like an example of something where you're doing it physically, but the idea is it's perhaps opening something up, in the creative space or in some other way.
Yeah, yeah. So this was something that Court and I talked about just before we started recording, but there are these mudras in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition where they're hand gestures. And they could be very complex and they could be quite different. And they involve, different motions of each hand, all occurring simultaneously in a kind of beautiful orchestration when they're done by an accomplished practitioner. And there may be some real kind of side benefits that these Tibetan yogis thousands of years ago had some experiential insight about that may potentially be revealed in some future science.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many interesting things. Yeah, that's another little rabbit hole, but it's interesting that the time at which you do those physical gestures, you're also doing these very elaborate movements with your imagination. You're like
Yeah.
you're visualizing whole worlds essentially. It's kind of like you're dreaming something into existence, but you're then doing these physical movements at the same time. It really is all about creativity in some respect. Well, there's so much. I've already kind of cataloged a whole range of things to talk about. I really want to, in a subsequent episode, I want to dig down a little deeper in the hemispheric differences in the resting state. And not only that you found those hemispheric differences, but what they mapped onto in terms of like more experiential qualities, like what was different about those people aside from the activity, the electrical activity in their brain. So maybe that's something we can dig into in a future episode.
Yeah,
And
I'd love to do that.
so, yet another great window into all the amazing work you've done, Richie. Thank you for sharing this and for everybody joining. Thank you for sticking around and spending a little time with us. I can promise many more discussions like this. So, if you found this interesting, there will be much more to come. So, thank you, Richie, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you, Court. Thank you all.